July. All right, it is 3:30. It's a special joint meeting between City Council and the Planning Commission, Tuesday, June 21st. I'd like to call the meeting to order and acknowledge that the press and public have been duly notified of the meeting in accordance with the Freedom of Information Act. Nicole, you want to do roll call for both groups just to ensure a quorum?
Absolutely. Councilmember Han,
Here.
Councilmember Goshen,
Here.
Councilmember Anderson, here, Councilmember Ward,
Here.
Councilmember Streetman,
Here.
Councilmember Popson, Councilmember Myers, here, Councilmember Pierce,
Here.
Mayor Pounds.
Here.
There's a quorum for City Council. Mr. Denton,
Here.
Ms. Nagelski.
Here.
Mr. Brown.
Here.
Mr. Corney. Mr. Cohen.
Here.
Mr. Stone.
Here.
Dr. Rubin.
Here.
You have a quorum for them as well.
Thank you. Nicole, any citizens sign up to speak?
Yes, sir. Mr. Ray signed up first. Jim Ray. And then Mr. Buford Witt also signed up.
Thank you for the opportunity. Little background, I came here because I've heard from contractors that.
Sure, there's a microphone right there. Thank you.
Okay, is that working?
Yeah.
I understood from contractors that you'd be trying to decide about restricting rental numbers in our houses. My wife and I have a little house at 521 Carolina Boulevard, J.C. Longhouse. Had it for 30 years this year. And first got it when I was stationed at Sumter, Shaw Air Force Base, and been coming there as often as we could ever since. That hadn't been that often a lot of times because we've been in Germany, Thailand, Saudi Arabia, etc. But none of that anymore. And we're looking because my son and my daughter and their spouses each have 4 children. So now we have 8 grandchildren. And I just spent a week with 4 of them in the little JC Longhouse. I'm still trying to recover. And they all want us to get a bigger house so we can vacation together. My son's stationed in Washington. He's in the Air Force like I was. And our son is in Germantown, Tennessee, where we're living now. But anyway, I wanted to just say, especially in these economic times, it's a bad time to be building, but we're going to try to do it hopefully a little bit later when things recover somewhat. But the builders have given me a price. They say, well, a year and a half ago we were costing $2.85 a square foot. Now it's $4.40 a square foot. Or not $4, $440 a square foot. And so we're looking at a 5 or 6 bedroom house. We've got one plan we're talking to an architect about. But at 3,600 square feet, that's a lot of money. And so we're very interested in renting it like we've been doing with this one for 30 years. But if it gets limited, one rumor is the council is considering limiting it to the same number of rental places are in your contract now. That would be 5 for us. Well, we made it 5, it's 6, I think, legally. So at any rate, if we get 5 or 6 bedrooms, we don't want it limited to 6 people because we won't even cover the air conditioning fees probably then. But so I wanted to make a bit of a presentation for the 3 minutes I have to hopefully encourage you to be a little bit upward with the list and not go down to what we did with a little JC Longhouse, which is one of the rumors I've heard. So anyway, I'm pleased to be here. I did work with the Miami-Dade government for a number of years after I retired from the Air Force. So I'm a little bit familiar with commissions and so forth and what you have to go through. But thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Glad I wore a coat with this air conditioner.
It's what you're doing. We just got it working this afternoon, so we're getting full benefit of it for sure. Thank you, sir. So again, purpose of the meeting today is a presentation and discussion of recommendations developed by the Planning Commission for the regulation of short-term rentals. And again, just for everyone, today is just a discussion. We're not voting on anything. We're just seeing where the Planning Commission's been for the last 8 months, Ron, I guess, somewhere in there. and looking at what their recommendations are, and then council will take it up to evaluate and go forward with any possible code changes, ordinance changes, staffing changes, whatever the next steps may be. So if we can start, Douglas, you want to start off with a short presentation and then we'll get into conversations.
I signed up to say something. You didn't get a name.
I had Mr. Ray and Mr. Witt.
Oh, I signed up too.
I didn't get any emails. I didn't get those. I got emails that said that
Yeah.
people make comments.
Douglas, hold that thought.
All right.
Coach?
Me now.
Yep.
Okay, I'll make it short. I'm a former football coach that's lived out here. I had property out here since the '70s. And
Do you mind stating your name and address for the record, please?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cal McCombs.
Thank you.
417th Avenue. And in football, probably the best saying I ever heard in the 45 years I coached was, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I don't know what's broke, to be honest with you, with this community. Whether we're having too much noise on it, too much noise, what's going on? It's got people not doing it. But a lot of people, if you look at this island right now, you don't get on for less than $1 million. And there's a lot of people that'll buy a place and rent it for a while. So they have an opportunity to, at some point, to live on the island. And I've always felt like this island, and I don't want, my big deal is I'm afraid we're gonna start saying, well, Kiowa does this, Seabrook does this, or those people down there do this. We're not those people, we're the Island Park. And to me, we got a tremendous blend of people that live here year round, that we have a great community. And we got a great resource with our rental properties. I mean, that's what this island functions on, is accommodation taxes, all that stuff. If we take that off, what's it gonna do? Be passed on to us that live on the island to make our revenue every year? So I want to make sure that we don't go too fast on this, in my opinion. The last thing I'll say is that I love this community. I do have a couple of rental houses on it. The only way I was able to live on this island was to buy me a couple of rental houses, finally get them paid for, and move into them because of the prices out. I think that the demographics of the island right now is going to take care of a lot of things that y'all might be afraid of. You're not going to get a lot of thugs out here at $1 million a pop. You're not going to get a bunch of thugs out here for $10,000 for a beach house for a week. So just be careful about what you're doing. The other thing I'd like to say is, planning committee, I respect all of you. Raise your hands. How many of y'all have rental properties? 3. Listen to these people, please. Thank you.
Do we have others that signed up and just didn't get? Mic drop.
Is that like running me out of here?
Al, okay. Great to be with everybody today. Because I'm old, I print the internet. That's what I do. So thank you very much for the very hard work that you guys put together here. You know, clearly everybody is concerned about this great island. I wanted to see.
Can you give us your name and address real quick?
Oh, sure. Ed Valley, 908 Carolina Boulevard.
Thank you.
Home of the Valley. So I wanted to take an opportunity to take a look at this and see if there was a way that we could, as residents, maybe help it out, contribute to it or build on it, right? So obviously a lot of hard work went through this, but I think one of the things that strikes me as I look through it is, what is the goal for the island? Because once you understand what the goal for the island is, then you can address the stakeholders, the renters, the landlords, the residents, and how things sort of impact them. But so if I were to ask that question, what as this was being constructed, what would you say that the goal was here? I tried to pull something out of it, but what do you think the goal is? That would be to Sam.
Yeah, this is time for you to talk to us, not a
Okay.
Q&A. Sorry.
All right, so let me give you the goal. No. So it would be great, I think, if we could sort of look at that and then begin to build, our strategies and tactics off of that and take care of every stakeholder, right? And I think what that might do is it might simplify a little bit of the complexity that can be found in here. The island, it has a little bit of tension to it, right? So we may not need all of this complexity exempt versus non-exempt, what zone are you in, licensed versus non-licensed. I'm not sure that we really need that. And the plan kind of looks to me a little bit like it tries to customize for it, right? It's like a chef who's making a stew, he's throwing this that in, he's a little obsessive, right? All of a sudden, there's many ingredients that brings it out to me like, that's the stew. Yeah. So I'm just wondering if there can be some simplicity sort of built into this, as well. The other area I want to address is really the impact on residents. Okay, because as I read this, and I'll give you these numbers, but maybe these numbers should be in here, right? Or my assumption, I'll give you. The impact on residents, as this is currently written, you could say the resident will lose 20% of the value of his home because he no longer has the ability to sell it to, another investor or another resident coming in. You could say that the residents are blocked from getting rental licenses at the street level.
Mr. Valley,
Yes.
your 3 minutes have passed. If you could please wrap that up. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so really quickly, there's so much here, but if you, look to make this equitable, you would grandfather all leases one time for everybody, for, landlords and for residents, or don't grandfather anyone, leave everything as is. If you wanted to go with the Theodore plan, that's a more equitable plan. But right now, the residents are disadvantaged from a financial perspective in this plan. And then the last thing is what about the easy stuff? There's so many easy things to do. 1 week rentals, that's a, area that maybe you don't want to go into. But why not use that for non-compliant landlords of rental properties? And by the way, that makes it safer for the cops. So, and then the last thing I'll say is, is there an opportunity for the residents, maybe a small subset of residents, not to create another committee, but to help build on this and put some, really, creative solutions together to make this thing really safe. And that's it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Who else signed up? Ma'am? Okay.
Thanks. I can do this with 2 hands. Thank you guys very much. Appreciate what you guys do for us, and thank you for all of you guys for taking the time that you spend analyzing this.
Just real quick, name and address.
Mark Mitchell at 126 Carolina. I appreciate the fact that council members were elected and hearing from residents who are the voters, who are the ones that kind of say, we want this to be a residence. And I understand that dynamic. I will tell you real quickly, 16 years ago, when I began my second career in this business, Randy Walker, who many of you know, who owns our company. I remember sitting in a town council meeting in this room, talking about many of these same issues about short-term rental licenses, having the same conversations. And Randy said, man, I stopped coming a long time ago because the dynamics, he had already been a realtor for 20 years here on this island from Wild Dunes. And he said, what's funny is the dynamics of this island haven't changed in 20 years. There's 20% of the people on this island that are renters that rent their homes as an investment home. There's 20%, or I'm sorry, 30%, a third. There's 33% that are investors. There's 33% that own their homes as second homes. And there's 33% who are primary residents. So when I got this little packet it's interesting now, 40 years ago, the dynamics really haven't changed a whole heck of a lot. So the question that Cal asked is, what is it that's changed? The other story I will tell you is that, well, in 1986, when I moved here, I came down from Charlotte, North Carolina in a U-Haul van on the first Saturday in April. And I crossed the old Cooper River Bridge. I got to Coleman Boulevard and I was stopped in bumper to bumper traffic. It took me about 2.5 hours to get on the island. So obviously this dynamic of traffic and having a hard time getting on and off the island isn't a new dynamic either. My wife and I bought our house. We've been on and off the island now because of kids going to high school over in Mount Pleasant, but we've now been back on the island for 2 years. We bought our house as a primary residence. Didn't really have any intention to rent it. But when I looked at the plan yesterday, we started talking about, boy, we need to get a rental license to preserve our ability. The reason that we chose Isle of Palms over Sullivan's Island, our kids all went to Sullivan's Island Elementary School, but we chose Isle of Palms is because of the dynamic. If you ever need to rent it, if for some reason, like Cal talked about, if economics change, things change in your family dynamic, it's a safety net. It's a great investment. And that adds value. There is actually, those of you who aren't in the real estate business, there's a second economic approach to appraising property called the income approach, which adds an additional amount of value to your home based on if you can add revenue to your property. So even if you grandfather in somebody's property while they own it, it still affects the ability for them to sell it for that same value. So anyway, long story short, I think that short-term
Mr. Benjamin,
response.
I know
Okay.
you're wrapping up.
I
You
will.
could stop.
Short-term response to your plan would be, obviously, there's going to be more rental licenses. And if there's a minimum income requirement, I guess I'll rent it for 2 or 3 weeks a year when I hadn't intended to in the past. So I'm not sure that this is the right way to go. Thank you for your time.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Gina Foster with Dunes Properties, and I'm actually here to represent some clients of mine that I've been building with now for quite some time. We actually are about to be completed over on 1028th Street. My clients, Laura and Chris Smith, would have loved to have been here today, but unfortunately couldn't make it. And I told them that I wanted to be here on their behalf. They are in the process of closing on this property, hopefully next month. And their hope and their goal is, and has been from the start, is to just take it as a second home, but also have the opportunity to rent it as an offset to the income for the mortgage. So I really hope that you will consider these people that have spoke today and the desire that we have on behalf of coming to you all in hopes that we can make a change maybe, but one that's beneficial to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Did anybody else signed up ahead of time? Good. It'll be long. All right, thank you all. Appreciate that. Again, we arranged this joint meeting just so council could hear from all of the planning commission members and let them discuss their findings fully. And just before we go further, Douglas, go ahead. And would like to thank the planning commission. I know you guys put in a lot of hours and time, and thank you for your efforts, and Ron for leading that effort to get to this point. So Douglas. Thank you, Mayor. Worst.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna, if it's okay with everybody, I'm gonna take maybe 10, 15 minutes. Start kind of with a little bit of historical perspective to kind of bring everybody up to speed with how this program has evolved over time. Talk a little bit about the specific task that council gave to the planning commission, what you all asked for, what the planning commission did in response to that, and then end specifically with what's being recommended to you all tonight. All right, Amy's working her magic back though. Do about 5 minutes worth of jokes first. And we'll move on. But I'll start and the slideshow will catch up here to us, but somebody said that it had been about a year that we had been looking at this, or since the planning commission was tasked with this. I took a little bit of exception to that. I felt like it had been much quicker. I did find in reading through the minutes that we were actually tasked, or they were tasked, on June 22nd, 2021. So here we are, exactly 1 year later from the date of the task, and giving you this recommendation. And on the evening of council, the task specifically back then was to look at a moratorium and at the possibility of a cap. So there had been other work that we'll go into pretty recently. In 2019, the planning commission did a pretty in-depth analysis of what was going on and worked through a lot of different recommendations. But I would say that this time around, they really did focus pretty closely on the idea of a cap specifically and a moratorium specifically. So that's the excerpt from the minutes of June 22nd. And here is a little bit of the background on what's happened over time. And you can see there that really the city's initial work with rentals started back in 2001. So we're kind of 20 years into regulating rentals. And big picture, there was an initial regulation that just required a license. So since the year 2001, short-term rentals have been required to have a license. There was an iteration there in 2002 where the size of houses got kind of shrunken to fit on the size lot that they were being built on. Shortly after that, the council in 2006 established occupancy limits within rentals. There's a series of different ways to figure out that calculation in terms of what number of renters can go into a specific house, but that's part of the code today, and that's been in the code since 2006. In 2010, there was a provision that stated that any newly constructed rental house would be limited to 12 people. The thought there was that the council didn't really mind if large houses were built, new big houses were fine, but the idea that they wouldn't be built solely for massive numbers of people to stay in those as a rental, so that they established that cap at 12 people in a newly built house. 2019, we'll go through, there's a next slide here that'll talk a little bit in more detail about that, but that was the one where the commission looked at a lot of things that have been going on. And I would say in the region, other communities started really looking at other ways to tackle the different problems associated in different communities with rentals. And so the commission looked at all of those and came forward with some pretty specific recommendations about how to deal with the parties and how to deal with the revocation of a license of what we'd call kind of a bad apple that's causing a nuisance for the neighborhood. So that was really the focus of 2019 and 2020. And then that brings us to today's topic and discussion of a cap. This slide is very small. I know you can't read it, but this is the 2019 work product of the Planning Commission. The point of concluding this is to just show that there was a very broad range of ideas thought about, talked about. Some were eliminated, many were implemented, and that got you to a point where we thought that bad renters could be, or properties that were becoming nuisances could be decently dealt with as a result of that 2019 work. So that brings us to the 2021 work of the Planning Commission, and they began their work by, and they've kind of consistently done this every time they start a project, they will look at what everybody around is doing. What are other things that are being done in other communities? We hear a lot about Folly Beach is kind of constantly wrestling with similar issues. Kiowa, the coastal communities are frequently dealing with the same type of problems that we have, and coming up with new ways to deal with those problems. So that was a part of that work product, is to look at what they were doing. The other things that happened is there was a lot of data collection and really merging of databases. Pretty neat tool was put together whereby the county's tax data was incorporated into the city's licensing data. And really the county's tax data has information about the size of all these houses, bedrooms, years built. So it gave us some insight in terms of what housing stock was being used for these rentals. And really the size of rentals, the location of rentals, the number of bedrooms and rentals, things of that nature. We also, and we'll get into some of the maps here in a second, but we have incorporated a graphic information system that lets us just kind of view the rentals and the trends happening within the various parts of the island. So we'll get to some of those maps in just a second. That was a slide explaining the creation of that database that we talked about. So in the collection of data, we're going to go pretty quickly over just a few points of that were identified. This first one is just showing that really over time, the number of short-term rental licenses has been fairly consistent. It was up in several years in kind of the 2010 era. There's each of these years has its own little kind of caveat in terms of its accuracy. For a while there, we didn't differentiate in our program between long-term rentals and short-term rentals. There's various kind of issues with each year that can be explained. There's been a time here recently that we've more aggressively tried to identify people renting without a license through software that we now use. So that created a little bit of a bump. But by and large, I think this graph shows us that the number of rentals cumulatively is fairly flat across the island. We went past one there. This is very, I'll go back one if I can. Well,
Douglas, can I ask you a question?
sure.
Numbers while you're going through this
Sure.
real quick? These numbers, the annual numbers, like if I'm looking at a certain year, it says 1585, does that they're renewed every year?
That's correct.
So if somebody went off,
That's
then
correct.
that's included and they went, okay, so
That
these
is
are
correct.
accurate,
That's
like, to the
total.
year.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's total at the end of the year. And of course, any given day, it would be a different number because right now there are probably some licenses in my office being processed that'll add to today's numbers. So we
But
kind of
current, they
strike.
have to be renewed every year.
That's correct.
Okay.
And these numbers are taken at the end of that year. So it let the number accumulate through the year. And then at the end of the year, we took the total. And that's what's being generated there.
Okay, and Douglas, can we say that the last 2 years have been affected by COVID, that we actually saw more people probably moving into their rentals rather than renting them?
Well, we'll get to kind of what we think is happening here more recently, but yes, I think the trend is showing that at least certain areas are going down. Whether it's
Well, that could go
slightly or
back up.
considerably, yeah, that's correct.
Okay,
We do not think that the number of rentals today is far above what it's been historically island-wide. But we'll get into the nuances of we think that different areas are being impacted differently, probably for different reasons. This is a somewhat generic occupancy graph that just shows what you all probably know, and that July and June and August. It's very full out here. We had a COVID dip there in March and April, which is, but I think by and large, that's what we would have all expected to see in terms of the occupancy of these rentals. So that key data, I think, is the source of that information. I will tell you that that's a very specific example, a very specific pool of rentals. So it's not something that we could say is a perfect indication of all rentals. That is a specific manager's pool of rental properties. So, but we think it's kind of indicative probably of the entire pool. This graph shows, and this to me is interesting anyway. It shows the percentage of houses that are specifically being built for rental. I think that there is a perception that houses, a certain number of houses, are being built specifically as a rental. This graph would indicate that the percentage and the number of houses being built specifically for rentals is declining over time. You can see that, there was a time there in 2003, 2004, where we were building 30, 20, somewhere between 20 and 30 new rentals per year. Here recently, that's been more like 4 or 5, most recently, 2 rentals per year. So we don't think we're building a tremendous number of houses specifically for rental. Not that they don't ultimately become rentals, but they're not being purpose built in large numbers as rentals.
And these are commercial rentals you're talking about.
Well, that would be any licensed rental.
How's that data, Garrett?
How is it gathered? So that is just our building permit. We just take all of our building permit numbers. We then go through everything that's been built that year and just see if it has a rental license.
Is it fair to say, Douglas, that many of those permits are residents and not commercial? For instance, the 50 that 2 became. No, can't say.
The breakdown and how the other, I wouldn't know of those that we didn't study the ones that didn't become rental, if they became second homes or primary residence.
Yes, but they were not commercial properties being built as in storefronts, retail.
No, they were in residential neighborhoods. If that was, Jane, your point.
Yeah.
They weren't in commercial districts.
I'm more interested in the residents that are being built solely to rent out for others to live in besides the owner.
Yeah, that is not happening in great numbers.
Okay, thanks.
Douglas, we don't have data for 2021 yet, right?
No, we don't. This graph was created early on in the planning commission's process. We could now update that to get last year's 2021's data.
And I would guess this is ancient history now, but 2003 to 2006, I would guess a lot of those rental homes were built on Palm. Maybe
Yeah, I don't know in terms of the geography of each of these, where that would play out. But we certainly can update 2001 because, like I said, this was being done in June, so we didn't have a complete year. So we can do that. Just general data collection. We all, and you will know from your public works agendas, that garbage collection goes way up in the summers. Obviously, some part of that is contributable to short-term rentals. We've just kind of go through the next 2 slides are going to be also quite obvious to you that the call for services for the fire department and for the police department obviously increase very Amy, we're not fighting on clicking on. It's just all my clicking.
I think you're just clicking aggressively, just click one.
I'm over clicking.
It's a regular guy.
Yeah, instant gratification. Okay, I want it to stop there. We'll see if it does that. So, that brings us to specifically the planning commission's recommendation. And we're gonna start here with a few maps, but I will tell you that their recommendation is to implement a cap on the number of rentals in 3 different zones on the back half of the back section of the island. So there would be a front section that is the section that fronts on Ocean Boulevard, the commercial district, Palm Boulevard, the section on the ocean side of Palm between 42nd and 57th, and then the commercial parts of Wild Dunes and the condos in Wild Dunes that would be uncapped. So on this map, and I think you will have probably closer copies in your packets, the uncapped areas would be pink. We would then have 3 capped areas, and those are short-term rental zones 1, 2, and 3. Section 1 would be the section between Breach Inlet and the commercial district. Section 2 would be the portion between the commercial district and include Wildwood, all the way through Wildwood. And then section 3 would be the non-condominium sections of Wild Dunes. The next few maps are going to show in detail each zone. And what you see on those maps, purple properties are kind of what we've been calling consistent rentals. They had a rental license at least in 2020, in 2022. The blue properties on those maps are properties that we consider to have fallen out of the program. They had a rental property in 2020, but did not have one in 2022. And then the red properties are what we are calling new rentals. So they did not have a license in 2020, but they do now have one in 2022. Zone 1, we think is fairly, it's probably one of the most consistent zones that we analyzed. The number in and out, I think, is exactly the same at 29. The number of consistent rentals is 42. And they're pretty well interspersed throughout the entire zone there. Zone 2 is probably it's the one that has the most, what I would call, kind of volatility. It's the same color coding. So purple is a consistent rental, red is a new rental, and blue is an old rental. And you'll see on this map that the second zone has had 79 new rentals out of, which is by percentage, a pretty large percent of new rentals in that neighborhood. And if you look at the red dots there, in my impression, they are getting farther back from the ocean front than they've traditionally been. So I think we all have thought of the demand for rentals as being really close to the beach in those first few rows. But I think this map is showing that we are having significant interest in new rentals showing up well back from the beach.
Do you have any data on that goes with what you just said? If the rentals are moving back because pricing is getting more expensive oceanfront, which makes sense. Do you have any data on whether or not the new rentals that are moving that are further back are in older houses versus newer houses?
We don't have that now. We may be able to, that's the type of information that overlays the county's data with our rental data. We can probably get to that point. We haven't done it yet.
Yeah, it's available.
Cal. Sorry, let this crowd go.
Yeah, and And I think that point has been made at the planning commission meetings too, that front beach, the price point at the front beach has gotten so high that it's kind of governing itself, and that it's very difficult for a new investor to buy that property, put it into the rental program and make it a profitable operation.
So I think it'd be important for us to have that information if it's available as it goes further back. Because to your point, if it's older houses that are getting into the rental program that are less expensive, as that migrates back into renovations and tear downs and new construction, perhaps the short-term rental problem takes care of itself. Is where I'm headed with that. That's what I'm trying to understand.
It's a risky bet.
Of course it is.
Is,
Just just looking for data. I'm not taking a position, just looking for data.
So of the
Well-
new rentals, which are new homes, new construction.
Well,
versus-
in this blue area, that section, which is what zone 2, which is primarily where the issue is, of the newer rentals, are those in older houses? or
Yeah, I
new
just don't know.
construction?
I don't know at
I
this
think
point.
that'd be helpful to know because of what that trend would show.
So the map here is the uncapped areas, and we're seeing that kind of as we're talking about, the number of rentals in those uncapped areas is reducing slightly. You do see a lot more purple on this map. So, I mean, those are those consistent rentals. They've kind of, like we said earlier, we've always known that there are rentals close to the ocean. So that's not terribly surprising, but I think the fact that it's going down in that zone confirms the hunch that they are migrating away from that area, probably because of price point, and back into the rest of the community.
Douglas,
Yeah.
if I might, Councilman Hahn, on the building permits that were completed, there is a number of those that got licenses in 2019 and 2020, it was 7 new homes got rental licenses.
Of how many total new homes? 7 of what?
54.
Okay, thank you.
That's on the
Thank you.
chart. But that doesn't say that 2021 didn't have a couple more.
this doesn't differentiate between short-term and long-term, right?
It
Or
does.
This is
Yes,
just, we're only
So in-
talking short.
that's correct. Yeah, we did not, when you think back on that graph that went back to the
Right.
2000, the first years of that graph did not differentiate, but here recently we have
So
differentiated.
we're only talking.
We're only talking short term.
Could
And-
you go back, sorry, you finished?
Well, do you, do you have a way of, if just because somebody's gotten the license doesn't mean that they're renting, right? Like this license doesn't have to, you don't have to.
Actually be a
do
rental.
anything,
That's
right?
correct. That's correct.
Well, actually, I think one of the important pieces is how frequently a house is rented. Correct.
Right.
Not only how many people are in it, but is rented 6 weeks out of the year or 26 weeks out of the year. We really don't know.
Or not at all.
Or not at all. That's right.
Yeah, and part of when we get to the recommendations, we'll talk about that because it does kind of become an issue. Right now, if you get a license and you choose not to rent, it's not really an issue for the city. But in the future, when we get to a point where caps are being met and you have a property owner that is taking up space within that cap, it becomes an issue. So that we have not historically been interested in that really, but we will, if this cap is to be implemented, we will become, we'll need to kind of watch for that happening. So-
Real quick, sorry.
Go ahead.
We did do some extensive analysis in the collection of our data. And in some of that, we noticed that there were still some short-term vacation licensed properties that were 4%. And the reason they're at 4% because of the South Carolina code that allows you to rent short-term up to 75 days. So we do know that we have residents that are moving out of their property and renting them and then moving back in theory.
So this chart is intended to kind of capture the numbers that were shown on each of those various graphs. I'm sorry, maps that showed the kind of migration in and out of the various zones. To me, what's interesting here and kind of historically, we have focused on the total number of licenses. And you'll see that between 2020 and 2022, there's only one difference. There's one number different. I think historically, I would have at least assumed that that meant that that the pool of licensing properties is the same and it's kind of staying on a flat curve. It goes back to the old a third analogy that or fact, I guess, that Mr. Mitchell referred to, that we've kind of always been in that mix. But I think this matrix shows that while the third is staying the same, the neighborhoods or the different areas individually are very dynamic. And there's a lot of movement within each zone that statistic doesn't really capture. And again, you're seeing a slight migration out of the uncapped area. You're seeing a slight migration out of zone 3, which is the Wild Dunes areas exclusive of condominiums. And you're seeing a pretty significant increase in zone 2, and then zone 1 is staying fairly consistent. So that was interesting, and I think useful for the Planning Commission. We have added, since your packet went out, people have asked about the breakdown of the total units. See, I don't want to be aggressive here, but I hit next slide about 10 seconds ago. I hit it again. It's probably gonna.
That's gonna go too.
So this is a fairly new slide that we've just added. But it goes back and reinforces that breakdown of roughly a third. And that is indeed holding true.
Douglas, when we looked at the uncapped areas and those that are falling off or have falling off since 2020, we saw that about 80% of those are moving into second homes, and about 20% of those are moving into primary homes.
Yeah,
What's moving?
So the properties that are no longer rental in the uncapped areas, the majority of them are staying as second homes.
Okay.
And only 20% have transitioned into primary homes. We still haven't done that same analysis on the other 3 zones, but we know it of the uncapped area.
So they used to have short-term rental licenses, and they're now either second homes or primary homes.
Correct, 80% and 20%.
Okay.
80% second homes. 80% have not changed their tax rate to the 4% rate. Yeah, so either they haven't done that yet, or they're second homes and not 20% primary residences in that uncapped area. So the question has been raised about, what is the objective of these rules and these recommendations, and to kind of characterize and summarize what we believe these caps would do is we think that we do see a trend in specific zones of rentals migrating into areas where they have not traditionally been. So these caps would stop that migration. They would establish, basically keep the rental numbers the same in those areas as they have, or close to the same as what they have traditionally been. And all of this, obviously, at the end of that slide indicates that the ultimate objective is to minimize the impact on the full-time residents that have been in these back areas. That's the group that I think you will hear from in terms of the impact that a rental has on their quality of life if they have not historically had those rentals. To now have rentals near them is impacting them.
Ask a quick question, Douglas. When we were going through the data, I recall, and I don't know where this
ended up or fell off, but we were tracking also rooms and occupancy. And I think we've got the ability, I think we came up, there's about 5,000 hospitality rooms on the island now. So with that being said, although the licenses might be staying the same, if we have which we do, we have the addresses of those licenses over years, we can see the licenses may be staying the same, but with all this migration you've demonstrated within the zones and even on the front beach, have the rooms gone up because we've been building bigger mini rental properties. So a 3-bedroom may be knocked down and a 6 or 7 bedroom may be brought up. So, I mean, the data, it might be helpful to have the data in the next round of the room growth or whatever those numbers show us. And also we have the ability to show occupancy. So we know what an occupant is in a permanent resident with a larger rental property that has 6 or 7 rooms in it. And we know some are grandfathered up as high as 28 capacity, with residents being at, basically 2.7 and a rental being 28. We got a 10-to-1 ratio there on an impact in the community. So I guess where I'm going, I'd like to see the occupancy and the room migration over that same period of time. And I think that's something that we can probably get our hands on. We have, to my knowledge, we cannot get to the occupancy of rental units. We have advertised occupancy.
You mean permitted occupancy?
Yeah, what's on the exact, right, not what's. Not exactly, right. But that'll still give us a.
Property, know that it's.
Right.
But
that, we don't know how many actually are in there. Exactly.
Right.
Yes. So that brings us to the planning commission's recommendations specifically are to establish those 4 zones within each zone, within the 3 capped zones. The recommendation is to establish a cap, a maximum number of rentals in each of those zones at a number that's 10% higher than the 2020 license number. We can talk about that, but we already know that the number 10% higher for zone 2 has already been met in 2022. So there's going to be, we're going to have an administrative exercise in how to deal with the fact that we could be creating a cap that's already being exceeded for zone 2. So that's kind of a wrinkle that we would, as this progresses, we would need to work through. As I think it's been kind of talked around, but the reason for those 3 zones, kind of the rationale there was in the planning commission's analysis. There was a clear indication that those 3 zones had very low historical numbers of rental properties around them. So they were in some zones as low as historically 12% rentals in the zone, up to about 20%. So those areas that were in a cap historically have had those very low numbers of rentals in those areas. The areas that are uncapped, I think cumulatively are about 50% already rental. So that is part of the logic in exempting certain portions. The other logic, as we've talked about, is those uncapped areas are to some degree being self-regulated by just market pressure is keeping those numbers lower. And we think going down historically and into the future, we expect that would go down. But part of, I guess, a commitment of the planning commission and was to look at this frequently, at least annually, to see, would it make sense to start, because things obviously can change at a moment's notice. Would those trends reverse themselves and we start to see an uptick in other areas that are currently planned to not be capped? Would we implement a cap there? So that's something the planning commission would be continuing to look at and plan to make recommendations back to you all. If and when a zone reaches its cap, there would be a waiting list that would be created. That waiting list would be treated on kind of a first one on a list would be the first one to get a license. When a license came available by somebody going out of the rental program. Part of that part of the recommended program would be to Councilperson Myers' point, if a rental property has, or if a property has a rental license, but it clearly isn't being rented, there's no intention of renting it, it's not being advertised for rental, it's not being actually rented, that property license would be transferred away from that property and then into somebody, into an owner that's on the waiting list. Property owners currently holding a rental license would be given the ability to renew that license annually. So it's not that if you have a license now, that you would lose your ability to rent. That's not the intended purpose of the recommendation. If you're currently renting the property, you would be allowed to continue to rent that property as long as you keep the rental license in good standing and renew it on time. The point was made that it would cause issues if these rental licenses were not transferable. So the Planning Commission's recommendation is that when a rental property sells, that the new owner of that property would also be able to rent the property. That's different than the Kiowa model. A lot of this is taken from Kiowa. Kiowa, you sell the property, that property does not transfer the license, but the next license goes to whoever's first on the list. So that was something that this community was loud and clear about, that they wanted the ability for that license to transfer. So that's the recommendation you all have. And then there's a few changes about occupancy that have been, and they're I guess related, but not exactly part of the cap system per se, whereby a newly constructed house in a capped area would be limited to a maximum occupancy of 8. Currently, that occupancy is set at 12, so this would reduce that slightly. And finally, if a property outside of the capped area, so in the uncapped area, ceased to be a rental for a period of a year or more, it would also revert to its occupancy limit of 12. Currently, if a property goes off the rental program for 5-10 years, comes back on, we look at what its occupancy was in 2010 and we issue a license for that amount. Under this recommendation, it would go back to 12. So that's it. Simple enough.
Douglas, thank you for doing that. I think it would be helpful for council, in my opinion, to hear from some of the planning commission folks, because I know y'all were all over the place on alternatives and different ideas and different thoughts, zones, no zones, all kind of things. And I'd love to hear from some of the planning commission folks, just kind of where y'all have been.
Can we just go back and put the parameters in place for this first? We had a lot of questions that have been confusing because we didn't know who we're talking about, and what's not in this thing.
Can you talk into your mic?
Am I got permission?
Yeah, I'm not sure where you're
All right.
going, because I feel like
Mr.
we
Mayor.
covered all that.
No, we have been getting a lot of emails, and there's a lot of misinformation already out there. And I just want to make it clear that we are only talking about single family rentals. We're not talking about multifamily. Am I right?
That is correct.
Okay, multifamily stays as it is now. That includes condos, townhomes. I don't know if there's anything else.
Correct.
Okay, that's fine. All right. We also are not talking about long-term single-family rentals. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so if you have a house and you want to rent it long-term, you can still do that. We're not even talking about changing those rules.
Correct.
Okay. In the Wild Dunes area, we do have the ability to legislate there. We're not governed by the planned unit development rules or anything like that. So is that correct?
We do, our current short-term rental policies all apply in Wild Dunes, and we believe we have that right.
Okay. And right now, we're really not talking about Front Beach, because Front Beach is all quote uncapped, which means it stays as it is now. This is Palm Boulevard from roughly 21st to through Wild Dunes, Ocean Boulevard.
Correct.
And
All of Ocean, all of Palm, all of the section between 41st and 57th Ocean side of Palm. That's correct.
Okay, well, both sides of the street though.
Both sides up until 41st.
Okay.
Then
And
once
it's
you get
just the ocean
across,
side.
then it's just the
Okay.
Ocean side.
Okay.
Right.
So to clarify, those are not on the table. Those will stay the same as what they are now. All we are talking about is short-term, single-family rentals. Which is, and what is short-term defined as?
Less than 90 days.
Okay. So it's usually weekly rentals for like summer months or something like that.
Well, any duration less than 90 days would qualify under the city's code as a short-term
Short-term
rental.
rental. Okay.
Yeah, can I,
Yeah.
Regardless
can I
of
ask
what-
a question for one of the
Scott, let
commissioners,
me
if that's okay?
Hey, Scott,
Okay,
real
go
quick.
ahead.
Sorry.
All right,
I told you
thank
to.
No, no, they'll go ahead.
So that,
Yeah, council's gonna have months to work on this and we can ask these questions and clarifications. I really want to hear from planning commission. Scott, you have something for Steve?
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to ask Steve, I watched the tape on the meeting last, the most recent one. And I think, Steve, you were, we're talking about capping and uncapping, and candidly, I'm a bit confused as to why we would have, we have residential, we have commercial. There were two zones already. And I think you had at the beginning of the meeting talked about, the intention of the zoning originally was for the analytical purposes and things of that nature. Would you mind giving kind of I guess, recap of what you said, and where I think I heard what you were saying is that if we cap certain areas and uncap others, it's going to have some fairly unintended consequences. And I'd like to hear more about what your opinion is on that and where we should probably go, maybe in your mind, on what maybe a best first solution.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not
So-
sure that's right, I think what the unintended consequences were.
Well, yeah.
Mainly my talk was, when we first put the zones together, I don't want to go too much. We had mountains and mountains of data, 5,000 parses, Excel spreadsheets, couldn't fit on a computer. We said, let's find a way to put these into buckets, so to speak. Where are the licenses? Where are the houses? What are 8 or 9 areas on the island that we should be looking at? Where do they fit? There are some differences between Front Beach and the condos and Wild Dunes and Ocean and Palm. Let's create 8 or 9 different areas and let's see where everything is. The purpose of that was not to regulate, so to speak. It was just to sort data, to look at the percent of primary residences, using the tax database, the percent of secondary homes, which of those have licenses. And that was really the last little spreadsheet that Douglas put up that said, here's kind of a summary of that, which by each of the original 9 areas that we had, how many are primary, how many are second homes, how many have licenses. So that was really the intent. And I was part of that, as were several other people on the commission. You were on the planning commission at that time. And that was really, so I wanted to be careful that we don't extract those zones too far, that they are some type of regulatory zone, or that there was some type of demographics that we said, okay, these are all the same, therefore this should be a zone. That was what I was trying to get across there, which is these were just literally data buckets. Okay, and let's not read too much into them at this time. The other issue I brought up was, if you look at the way it kind of split, there's roughly 4,700 parcels on the island based on the tax base with tax numbers and tax codes. So roughly, I'm going to talk plus minus 100 here. 2,700 of them now fall into the zones 1, 2, 3. They're going to be capped. 2,000 fall outside of that. Of the 2,000 outside of that, about 50% have licenses. That means we're leaving almost 1,000 uncapped potential licenses outside of that. And I just wanted to raise that for discussion in the last commission meeting. That we're really not, if the idea is to cap, we're still leaving 1,000 parcel potential for another 1,000 licenses outside of the cap zones. So that was really what the discussion was about.
Yeah, no,
Thank you.
if I could add on to that, I watched the meeting as well, and I thought you brought up a good point. The fact that instead of having zones, if you just put it, except for maybe down in Front Beach in the commercial districts, but you just put a cap on the total number, the market will essentially take care of itself potentially, and the growth would occur up to the cap, and not have zones, but an island-wide cap. They would they would more or less go into the same places they have been, because that's where the market has dictated they're going.
We've been at this for 12 years.
And then you don't want to get into the zones and the migrate of that area, which I thought is a very valid point you brought up, and probably one we should look at further. I have one follow-up question on the transferability and your thoughts on that. I know one of the reasons that is brought up, and it's mentioned in some of the emails we've received, is this 90-day issue. But that seems like it could be easily legislative out. You can give a 90-day temporary license to every sale that has occurred. So I'd like to hear more on your thoughts around that transferability issue. What drove you to the decision that you came to on that?
So when that came up, and I did a lot of digging through when we did the zones, trying to redraw the lines, whether, Oceanside of Palm versus not Oceanside of Palm, how that broke out and did, moving around. One of the things, and that was what Doug pointed out, is what didn't realize when we started this, is like I said, the amount of, 240 licenses this year moved. And that's, I think, coming from my perspective, was part of the problem. Was from the livability side, is it's not that the rentals are growing, it's just they're moving into places they haven't historically been. So that was what kind of like drove my kind of reason for the transferring it. Is if you don't transfer it, you're just moving a rental from one place to another, to a new place, which is part of the turmoil that I think causes our livability issues. So that was kind of my swaying point to say, let's leave the rentals where they are if possible, instead of having them, the house sells and then do a new rental props up, 2 blocks away.
Yeah, and you're theoretically locking in those rentals for
As much as possible, but
Yeah,
I mean,
And the debate, in my debate, counter to his argument was, if someone's been on the island for 30 years and they go to apply for license, and someone just bought a house that's a non-resident that has no intention of living here and is just renting the house, that they fall behind that person in line. So I raised just a fairness question. Is that fair to someone who's been a resident here for a long time? And that was the debate we had. So
yeah.
And that could be dealt with. I mean, 12 years ago, last time we looked at short-term rentals, most of the complaints that we were hearing from the residents was noise. And so we developed a whole set of regulation to deal with noise complaints. And so the problem is no longer noise complaints. Those have pretty much petered off. The word now that they're hearing from everybody is the livability. And of course, rentals are fine until they're next door to you. They're next door to you, they're next door to me. And that's when it starts to hurt. And that's why I kind of like the notion of the zone areas. Their island does have different feels wherever you are. I mean, ask anybody who comes from out of town to the beach. They go to 25th Avenue for a reason. They go to 42nd for a reason. So while the beach has different characters, our little pockets of neighborhood have different characteristics. And so it kind of makes sense. And I would like to, preserve the more quiet neighborhoods to remain quiet neighborhoods. And that's why, all this kind of works. Now, we work around Steve's issue of longevity. And there have been recommendations that if you've lived here for X number of years, that perhaps you have preferential treatment on a rental. And I'm all for that. That sounds great. But I would just hate to see, more quiet parts of town, more Forest Trail, for instance, not to pick on an area, but to see that proliferate with the rentals that, somebody didn't keep up their rental on Palm or Ocean Boulevard, and it migrates there. And that's what, what we were trying to see is the progression, the migration of these rental licenses, and trying to keep them out of the quiet places. Not that we give up on the noisy front beach, but if I was coming to a beach community for vacation, that's really where I'd rather be. But then you get people who are renting further away from the ocean, spending more time in that pool, more games of Marco Polo, and so more distraction for the residents, and more leaf blow. It's my other. Because all those people have a yard care.
To that So one of the things you just talked about, the livability issue, was there any discussion of maybe, I don't know, making it harder to renew, like making the restraint, if, I think it was, what was it, 5 complaints or something, you don't get to renew. Any way of making it so that, the bar is raised, so to speak, and so if it is a problematic rental, that gets kicked out of the pool.
We've tried that a couple of years ago as well. And that's the discussion kind of didn't always necessarily go so far. There's policing efforts and just keeping track of other complaints and complaints in succession. And, are there bad renters or bad rentors? And that's, kind of a tough thing for a homeowner who's entrusting their rental agent to only rent to good people. And so, even in our little historical data, we never found too many properties that, made it to 5.
That was my
No one's
next
really
question.
been threatened
no.
with losing their license, and by golly, I'm sure my wife has tried. But, and there you have it. So there are, what's a complaint and what's a, the terminology we used,
Founded complaint.
compounded.
I think we had an incident recently where it seems like our update of the ordinance is working, where there was a noise complaint. It was investigated by the police. And as part of the complaint, they now contact the realtor or property manager for that property who came. And at that point, the property manager has the ability to declare that they're not in compliance with the lease, and was able to shut down that location. That's something the police cannot do, but the property owner or the realtor, the leaser, can. So, and that was a founded complaint, obviously, at that point, that was also taken care of. So I think we're on the road to doing that in the way we want to. That's sort of an aside.
Scott and then Blair.
This is more of a question to Chief Cornett and Chief Oliverius. We have these ordinances on the books. Occupancy 12, I think total people that can be on the, is it 40? Pardon? Yeah. Cars
Double
are
the
limited.
Occupancy.
Pardon me?
Double the occupancy now. It's no
Up to
longer
40.
40.
Up to 4, yeah, during the day or something. And then at night, you're limited to 12 or whatever your grandfathered number is. And then you've got the noise ordinances and things of that nature. Can you tell us how many, since you've been here, how many violations have been, I guess, given for over occupancy or anything like that? And the other question I guess I have for you is, as the ordinances are written today, do you have even the ability to enforce them in your mind? And is it, well, I'd like to hear your comments.
I think
And
for this
if you
one,
have any recommendations, throw those in too.
I'll come up here to address you for this, if you don't mind.
No, please.
I kind of figured this question might arise. So I've gathered some data for you. Just give you some data and then I'll answer direct to your question. In 2021, the police department responded to 11,372 calls for service total. We had 26 incidents where we responded to a short-term rental. I'm sorry, not a short-term rental, but 26 incidents to livability complaints, 24 different properties within that 26. So 2 of them were double, had more than one incident. 23 of them were short-term rentals. 1 was a resident. All 26 of those were noise complaints. And out of those noise complaints, they ranged from loud music to loud talking, to yelling, to loud pool parties, and those different things. In 2022 thus far, through the end of May, we responded to 4,152 calls for service, 13 incidents dealing with livability, at a total of 11 different properties. So 2 have had more than one incident. Out of those, 10 were roll cart violations. 1 was debris, 1 was other code enforcement violation, and 1 was a noise violation, which would be the one that we recently talked about. When you get to occupancy enforcement, the issue we have with that is that I strongly believe in the Constitution And when somebody rents a house or a hotel room, the Fourth Amendment goes with that. Their right to be protected under the reasonableness for search and seizure. And so we really cannot just go knock on a door and start counting people. I believe other countries have tried that and it did not work so well for them. But we don't want to find ourselves in this day and age doing that. And even the vehicle occupancy gets difficult because that ends at a certain time. And when we go tell them, all we have to do is say, you cannot have this many cars on your property. What are they going to do? Move them into the right of way where they are legally allowed to park them at that point. And so they're difficult. We have written 0 tickets and written 0 warnings for any of those since I've been here. The way they're addressed, if we respond to a loud party or a loud noise, we address it there. The incident that Councilwoman Anderson just brought up was a very large party. And I have to commend the Planning Commission on the rule, the section in there that said that somebody had to respond. We dealt with this in 2020 and nobody was able to respond. We do not have the ability to make people leave a structure, and that we can't do that. We wrote tickets that year and we arrested people in 2020. The same group rented a house in 2021. The difference was because of that rule, somebody responded, and as scared as she was when she got there, we stood with her when she said, y'all got to leave. And it ended the incident and led to an arrest and 1 seizure of a firearm out there. So those rules are beneficial and they are moving and progressing forward. I would be cautious with the number of people inside. That is a hard one for us to enforce with those. Did I answer your question, Councilman?
No, you did. Yeah, I was wondering, of the ordinances that we've written, are they practically enforceable? And I think what you're telling me, if I'm hearing it correctly, is that 12 occupancy is really it's not a highly enforceable from a police standpoint.
Correct. And even as council and public safety committee have been working on the noise ordinance, it's a subjective response. I've responded to calls when I'm working a night shift out here where it is an elderly individual who has his hearing aids turned off and he's just yelling because he can't hear and he doesn't realize how loud he is. That is technically a founded complaint. In the past, we had to write tickets and get 3 convictions. And it would not be something that we would write a ticket to somebody for somebody who had their hearing aids turned down and they're just loud. So that's the subjectiveness that, police don't work well in subjectiveness. We like it to be, it's either right or it's wrong. That's how we enforce it. So, but that's why we're working on those ordinances.
Any feelings on the 5, 3, 4 strikes or?
The 5 strikes, I will tell you, like I said, we've only had, when I pulled 2021 and 2022 this year, we've had 2 structures that have 2 incidents. Normally, we can meet with our partners in the property management companies. And when things are done correctly, which they have not been on our part all the time, I will say that up front. What's supposed to happen is they are supposed to get there, see a violation, mark it as founded, whether they write a ticket or not. And a copy is supposed to go with the individual renting. And then a copy is supposed to be put at the property management company. So when they walk in the following morning, they already have that information so that they can address it. That has not been done all the time as though it should. As we move forward with our code enforcement and building it up, one of the first things we'll do when our new code enforcement gets here is we will be meeting with all of the property management companies so that we build that relationship on the front, and it is much stronger than it is, and that would resolve a lot of the issues that we have. Blair?
Thank you, Mayor. My question is just to council generally. If this is a livability issue, and it appears it's his primary livability issue, and Wild Dunes already has a POA in place that deals with livability issues, why would we layer on top of Wild Dunes anything? Why are they included?
We left that for you all to figure out.
I know the legality of that issue, so you guys can decide that.
Well, not as a legal issue, but
Right,
they've got their own rules. Yeah.
And we did talk about the number or the lack of issues in there. However, it being a residential primary location, much like 1 and 2, we extended it into Wild Dunes and Area 3.
Well, would there be the risk that if we left Wild Dunes out, that they would get a flood of, I'm just thinking out allowed here.
Go either way.
That,
Yeah.
yeah, if we left them out, they could end up bearing the brunt of it.
But then their POA would deal with that, whatever their rules are.
Oh,
Yeah, I would just say that I think part of the reasoning is that they have always been incorporated into the city's code in terms of short-term rentals. All of the licensing requirements, occupancy limits. So we have very consistently always applied the same rules to Wild Dunes in terms of short-term rentals, since the beginning of this program. That's probably the main reasons we have just always done it. It's worked well, I think, thus far.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll take a little different spin on this thing, I think, and rather than the caps, but my thoughts are, how will this affect overall property values on the island long term? I mean, what would this have a negative effect? When you start capping, if we start having people to some of the points where people invest in these homes someday hoping to retire here, and all of a sudden they get very skittish about what's going on with caps. We have a run on the short-term rental licenses. We have a loss of revenue. We have a subsequent loss of tax dollars coming out of that. And that, that longer term effect is what I'm concerned about. And I think, having lived here for 38 years myself, the demographics of this island, where we have, families, where we have who are living, not on, on fairly limited income, but are able to just be in here. And those who have bought from off island who hope to retire here someday. I'm just concerned that if we get too strict with this, or if we overreact, we have some unintended consequences that could definitely negatively affect the finances of this island and also our taxes as citizens of this island. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I know we're limited in time, but somebody's wants to weigh in on that.
Andy.
So we haven't had caps. And we've had arguably 50 to 100% price increases, to your question. The market has shrunken, arguably. The number of licenses, the trend, well, it's not flatlined, it's gone up and down, but it's not 1,000 on and 1,000 off of the rental license. It's a couple hundred. I think the market's taking care of itself. Putting caps on it, to your point, Rusty, may have some impact, but I think it's going to push it in a different direction than what you're thinking. It may very possibly increase pricing, or it may have no effect at all. We're capping an area right now that it appears, because of the increased prices, Ocean, Palm, some of the condominium complexes, which are that many of them almost doubled in 2 years. In my mind, it's crazy. But and you're seeing an increase in the inner island communities, and that's why I personally voted to, and I'm in favor of capping zone 1, 2, and 3, because I feel like if we don't do anything, we're going to see more of a migration into that residential area. So kind of answer sort of what you were
Thank you for
asking.
your thoughts.
Yeah, so we've got a few minutes left. So any final comments from the planning commission before we need to get to Ways and Means here shortly? Marty, were you going to say something?
I can
Yep.
say something, I'm not gonna say anything that hasn't already been said, but, part of what we aimed to do, we made these recommendations to you guys, come up with something that's be well received, and that's, as we sit here and debate, it's probably mission impossible. Now you're in a police, but, the zone 2 map speaks for itself. There's been an infiltration in that area, and those were some comments that started this whole process last year. So by breaking into the zones, we address that for some of those folks at a reasonable level. We're not trying to change the dynamic of the island. If the market sorts itself out, then we'll continue to do that by instituting a cap that's a little bit of growth. I think we can find ourselves here. Say, hey, we didn't need to do that in the first place, but hey, we're just, it's a safeguard to get achieving that imbalance.
And perhaps also that any result that any new legislation or work product be monitored over time. I mean, we could make a cap this year and say, man, that was stupid, or that is hurting us, or it's not enough, or it's too much. And so revisiting it every year, that's something we can do with planning commissions, or you can do with council, whomever. You know, it's important to get it right and to let it live and breathe with the island as well, to make sure that we are effective and not punitive. The intent is really not to be punitive, but to be controlled.
Steve,
not controlled.
sorry.
To pile on to that and then my final comment. I agree. I think it's something that has to be managed and monitored over time. And if you do that, the database we created is, we barely scratched the surface. There's so much data out there. It took a lot of hours and volunteer hours and donated time hours to get where we are. And I think if we're going to continue this, I think we need to look at how we're going to continue to generate that data. Other than managing it on some of the biggest Excel spreadsheets I've ever seen. So my recommendation is if we're going to monitor this and go forward, we need better data collection and better data management and monitoring.
Which we put in the budget, I think.
I was gonna say, do we need a person that does that?
We need,
I don't know if the person, GIS database is getting pretty user friendly.
Oh, yeah.
The one we have right now is kind of clunky, but it does work. But I think something needs to be looked at.
You got a new guy.
he's been burning up the keyboard, man. Yeah. Other planning commission comments before we,
Just reiterate that the 1 year look back, I think, is key to this whole thing. And a reanalysis at that point, if there are problems and issues, the unintended consequences.
so I think next steps for council, we've got, hopefully, there's a College of Charleston professor that's kind of a guru on short-term rentals that we're gonna have him come to our workshop in July and talk about, you know, what he is seeing all around the country. You know, I know we are a unique community, but he's been involved all around the country in putting together ordinances and no caps and caps and everything else. And I think it'd be worthwhile to hear from him, just from somebody else's viewpoint. And again, this is not going to be a quick decision or a quick path by any stretch. You guys have already spent a year, Douglas, on this topic.
Is that Brumby McLeod?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think, I think that's our next step from a council standpoint. I think it's just more information is better, whether it's data or somebody's insight that's, you know, had some input around the country on helping other cities. So Planning Commission, thank you again very much for this, for your work. And I know it was a lot. And Steve, to your point, it was a lot of volunteer hours. So thank you for that. Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second. All